PBS is sponsored by you, the viewers, for you, the viewers. Tomorrow's news today.
I have a call with Trita Parsi now, where we'll be talking about what is shaping up in the region. Start virtual camera. Okay. Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
What's going on, Trita? Great to have you back on the broadcast.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
All right. Let's get right into it. There's a lot to talk about. Since the last time we had a conversation, things have not really changed necessarily, but there's been more of the same. And what I mean by that, of course, is the fact that Trump is still claiming victory after victory every single day, and claiming that Iran is humiliated, destroyed. He holds all the leverage, he holds all the cards, and yet seemingly there was supposed to be a ceasefire negotiation that was supposed to take place in Islamabad this week potentially, but the Iranian side said that was not the case, and Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, went to Islamabad for bilateral talks between Iran and Pakistan, which the Trump administration seemingly wanted to take advantage of to make it seem like there was a real ceasefire that was going to be implemented. And now we know Abbas Araghchi has left Islamabad, and Trump this morning said that he is not sending Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. We have. I wanted to hear from your side of things. You're much more knowledgeable on this issue than myself. So where do you think we're at now? Is there going to be a ceasefire?
I mean, look, the ceasefire is still in place. It's just that within that ceasefire, the Trump administration is continuing to commit an act of war, which is the blockade of the Persian Gulf. And the question is, will the Iranians essentially calculate that they can withstand that pressure longer than Trump can, because oil prices are still not coming down in the manner that Trump needs them to? Or will this be painful enough for the Iranians that they will start escalating on other fronts, mindful of the fact that Trump essentially is still conducting something that, according to international law, is still an act of war while there's supposed to be a ceasefire? I think what we've seen in the last couple of days is quite embarrassing at times. I mean, as soon as Trump seems to think that the Iranians are going to go somewhere, he announces that talks are going to take place, that Witkoff and them are ready to go, and then kind of in a very embarrassing way have to issue a tweet saying that he decided not to send them. Its reality is that it's very clear the Iranians have made it utterly clear they're not going to come back to the table unless Trump lifts the blockade. And I think it's important to go over what happened prior to this, because it's a perfect example of how Trump is undermining, self-sabotaging his own diplomacy because of this inability to resist the urge to declare victory, to humiliate the other side on Twitter. So there had been some engagement through the Pakistanis. Face-saving exit for both sides had been essentially agreed upon, in which the Iranians said that they're lifting their siege or their blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, allowing the ships to go through according to their own rules. Still, nevertheless, it was a bit unclear. But this was supposed to last as long as the ceasefire lasted, and the US was supposed to reciprocate by declaring that they are at the same time lifting the blockade. Instead, Trump issues a tweet saying that he's won, that he's not going to lift the blockade, and essentially insults and tries to humiliate the Iranians. And the Iranians immediately declared then that, okay, well, then the blockade is back in place. So they're closing the Strait of Hormuz once again. And then since then, it's been really difficult to get to the table. And part of the reason why this is self-sabotage is because Trump actually had a bit of an edge, because he still managed to get what he wants, which is to get out of this war through this ceasefire, whereas the Iranians have not gotten the key thing they want, which is to get sanctions lifted. They can only get that if diplomacy takes place. But then he is eliminating that edge that he has by proving himself to be so untrustworthy. If you're in a scenario in which the other side is actually in a slightly greater need than you are to come to the table, then you should do everything you can to make sure that that happens because you do have a bit of an edge. But if you at the same time act in such a way that makes you utterly untrustworthy, that it doesn't matter if the other side needs to come to the table more than you do, because the table is not there, because you're not trustworthy. You cannot deliver on any of your promises. You don't hold your words. So, what's the point of diplomacy, even if you are in greater need, to go to the diplomatic table if the other side is incapable or unwilling to follow simple exit ramp mechanisms? I mean, we're talking about two countries that have very little trust. How do you build trust in these type of scenarios? You say, well, if you do this, I'll do this. And if both sides comply, they take another further step. That's how you bring things together in a scenario in which is almost entirely void of trust. And he failed at step one. He was supposed to do something very simple, refused to do it. And incidentally, don't take it from me, he said it himself. He said in an interview 2 or 3 days ago that everyone was happy. His advisors advised him to do it, to just follow suit. But he said, no, they're going to get $500 million in tolls. So I'm not going to do it. And I essentially called for it to collapse. And here we are. Now he's pretending as if the other side is begging for talks, where it's very clear that the other side is actually avoiding the talks. So this blockade of the blockade did not become leverage for Trump. It became something that blocked diplomacy.
Yeah. So speaking of the table is now Islamabad. And what I was wondering is what your assessment is on some of the reporting that has taken shape now about the way that the Pakistani mediators have been dealing with both sides here. It's in a unique predicament. It's new for Pakistan as well to center itself in these negotiations, and they clearly want to get the prestige of having the Islamabad Accords be the place where this situation comes to a close. However, there's now reporting that the Pakistani side has often played a role in overemphasizing the Iranian interest in having ceasefire negotiations take place at direct odds with what the Iranian side has communicated over and over again. Do you feel like this is Pakistan trying to engineer a situation in the way that they're used to, in the way that they've dealt with respect to the United States, or is there something else going on here?
Well, if we take a step back and then we see that there are three key actors in this dance: the US, Pakistan, and Iran. And we just ask ourselves a very simple question: whose conduct right now seems to be the most erratic, the most unpredictable, the most untrustworthy, the most undisciplined, the most unhinged, the most incapable of treating social media in a responsible way?
It's definitely not Pakistan.
It's not Pakistan. That doesn't mean that the Pakistanis may not have overstepped their mandate. They may not have oversold something at times. That's quite possible. Even the most experienced mediators at times may commit that mistake, and the Pakistanis, at least in the US-Iran context, are not experienced. I think there's a bit of frustration on the Iranian side in which they believe that the Pakistanis actually oversold to them the American agreement to that step-by-step de-escalation that had been designed. And I'm not so sure that even that is the case. To me, it sounds much more likely that the American negotiators once again agree to something, and then last minute, Trump pulls the rug under his own negotiators. This is not, in that reading, it would not be the fault of the Pakistanis, because the American negotiators are there as well. They are negotiating what they think is what Trump wants. And then last minute, Trump changes his mind. He's done this numerous times now, just in the US-Iran context, in which Kushner and Witkoff said that they thought that the Geneva proposal would really please Trump, and they left with that message to the Iranians. And 2 days later or 3 days later, Trump is at war with Iran. So I think the most likely scenario is that you have Trump changing his mind, changing the goalpost, not caring about how he cuts the credibility of his own negotiators at the kneecap. It's part of the reason I was wondering whether this was, from a political standpoint, the smartest thing for JD to do, to actually take on this issue, given how difficult it is to negotiate on behalf of Trump when he keeps on changing his mind, when he also keeps on listening to Mark Levine and the Israelis and Netanyahu, who then come in and influence him last minute in the negotiations, and everything that has been agreed upon before ends up collapsing. So could there be some error by the Pakistanis? Certainly. Is that the most likely scenario, just given what we can openly see with our own eyes? This is not where I would be looking first, nor would I be looking at this other narrative that the White House is pushing out, that the whole problem is because the Iranian leadership can't get their act together and that they're in disarray, etc. Again, not implausible that there's a lot of disagreements within their leadership. There always are. Those disagreements tend to come to the fore in the midst of negotiations when tough decisions need to be made. But is that really what we think is happening, given what we are seeing happening on social media? It's funny to me how the Western media is always looking for the least likely explanation.
Well, the reason why I wanted to start off there is because by process of elimination, I want to go through the different parties that we aren't currently discussing, because obviously Pakistan is where these talks are being held, and it's between the United States and Iran. However, there are other parties not involved in the direct conversations that are very clearly involved as far as the influence they hold over the American side, and even influence they hold over the Iranian side. I'm, of course, referencing Israel. How much of these negotiations, by your estimation, it's hard to speculate, it's hard to know, but how much of these negotiations do you think are being sullied by Israel's influence? Because it's very obvious that they have said over and over again that they were not party to the fact that even negotiations or a ceasefire was supposed to take place. They were very frustrated when they found out about it as well, both the Israeli public and certainly the Israeli government, and even struck Lebanon in a way that they had not done so in quite a while. The 300 civilians that they slaughtered in a matter of 10 minutes. In the immediate aftermath of the ceasefire conversations taking place. So how much do you think Israel is involved in managing the relationship with Trump directly?
Well, we do know a couple of things. We know that the Israelis have direct access to Trump and have sidelined and sidestepped the American policy process, which already has been quite chaotic in Trump 2, not as chaotic as it was in Trump 1, but nevertheless. So they have that access and they have that ability to play Trump psychology. Trump tends to be influenced by the last person he speaks. And if that ends up becoming Netanyahu, that definitely has a significant amount of influence, given how Trump is operating. It would not necessarily be the case with other presidents who would follow a completely different process and structure for their decision making. So far, I have to say, I've not seen clear evidence that the Israelis themselves are the reason why this has not gone forward. Now, indirectly, I do believe that the Israelis share a tremendous amount of responsibility for this outcome, because we're seeing how Trump keeps on pushing for maximalist positions, whether it is zero enrichment or 20-year enrichment, things of that nature that ultimately were put forward. At least zero enrichment was put forward by the Israelis as a way of sabotaging the talks. But even if we don't see that evidence right now, I would say, though, that I think it is very clear that if the talks end up taking place, and if they end up becoming serious, if Trump manages to keep a degree of discipline to get across the finishing line, or getting very close to the finishing line, at that moment, history teaches us that the Israelis will do absolutely everything to scuttle any deal between the United States and Iran that entails sanctions lifting. Keeping the sanctions in place is essential to the Israelis. The broader game of the Israelis is to establish a balance of power in the region that essentially eliminates Iran as a geopolitical player that can challenge Israel. This means degrading their industrial base, destroying their universities, destroying their steel plants, pharmaceutical plants, just set them back decades. When they're saying bombing them back to the Stone Age, They're not kidding. It's not an exaggeration.
Yeah.
It is not just a kind of a saying. This is their strategy. This is what they've done in Syria. This is what they have done or doing right now in Lebanon. It's about keeping everyone else weak so that they can have security through dominance. But there's two ways to do this. One is to go to war, which they've fought very hard for the last 25 years to get, but it's difficult to get there. And even when you do it, it may not result the way you want. But if you succeed, it will actually set the country back very fast in a relatively short time because you're blowing things up. The alternative way is to have long-standing sanctions that for decades grinds down the industrial base of the country, slowly but surely destroys its fabric of society, its ability to be able to have a proper functioning economy. This is what was done to Iraq under Saddam Hussein. It's not entirely Israel's fault in that context, but nevertheless, this is a different methodology of just defeating your enemies. With Iran, they've had those sanctions on for more than 3 decades now. And the Israelis are upset enough that Trump has ended the war. It would be much, much worse, unacceptable from their standpoint, if sanctions are lifted. And at that point, I think we will see significant pressure on Trump, and it will probably lead to Trump's biggest fallout and confrontation, not just with Netanyahu, but with Miriam Adelson, with his other big pro-Israeli donors, etc. And given how Trump has kind of lost the Tucker Carlson wing of MAGA, it's not clear to me whether he feels ready and comfortable to take on the remaining supporters that he had, at least on the financial side, which are the donors that are in line with Miriam Adelson on this issue.
So I also want to ask the last party involved here, which is, of course, China. It's not a secret that China gets an overwhelming amount, if not the overwhelming majority of its energy needs from the Strait of Hormuz, and not just from Iran. As a matter of fact, Iran, I believe, made up pre-operation Epic Fury approximately 10% of, or even smaller than that, of China's oil and energy needs in particular. Most of it still comes from the other Gulf states. And now, with the Strait of Hormuz being effectively shut off, it's getting a lot of the additional Iranian oil tankers. Having said that, however, China wants stability. It's good for trade. All they care about is trade for the most part. And continuing to develop these other countries in the One Belt, One Road initiative. How much do you believe is China pursuing stability and maybe even urging Iran to engage in a ceasefire conversation? And how much is Iran even invested in listening to China? And how much aid do you think China is offering to Iran beyond or urging them to engage in a ceasefire, and if their interest is actually leading Iran towards a ceasefire rather than continuing to pursue some kind of military campaign to secure its maximalist goals?
So you're, first of all, absolutely right, Hassan, that the Chinese are primarily focused on stability and their economic development. They're very strongly disciplined and avoiding getting entangled in other countries' conflicts. They're not going at this ideologically, immediately taking sides in conflicts, believing that those conflicts have anything to do with their credibility and things of that nature. They're the total opposite of the United States. There's not a conflict around the world that the United States doesn't feel it needs to get itself entangled with and interfere with, fully not understanding at all what the conflict necessarily is, but nevertheless, this sense that because it is a superpower, because apparently global stability depends on the United States, in this mindset, everything touches US interest. And it's been disastrous for the United States to pursue this path, in my view, and it's part of the reason why multipolarity is arriving earlier than it otherwise would have. The Chinese are the opposite. They don't have any particular attachment to Iran. They have strategic arrangements economically with almost every country in the region. And Iran is certainly not more important to them than the GCC are. But they have managed to make sure that they don't get entangled in Iran's conflicts with the GCC or vice versa. Now, would they intervene in such a scenario in order to get the Iranians to agree to a ceasefire? I believe that in the earlier case, the Chinese may have, at the last moment, convey their desire for the Iranians to go along with this.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't see the Chinese pressuring Iran unless they believe that the proposal on the table is a relatively reasonable one. Because otherwise, if there's an unreasonable proposal on the table and they end up pressuring Iran, they have made themselves an instrument in America's or in Trump's losing negotiation. And that's not their interest. They don't want to own this at all. Even if they intervene, they will do so quietly behind the scenes without saying anything to anyone, no press release, no press conference, because they don't want to have responsibility for the outcome. But if they intervene too early, if they do it publicly, and if they do it in a manner that actually is pushing Iran towards something that clearly is not going to work because it's unreasonable, it's imbalanced, then they have made themselves an instrument in Trump's game. And that would be the worst outcome for them. So I don't think they're right now putting much pressure on the Iranians. Are they unhappy with the situation? Absolutely. Who do they blame for that situation? I don't think they're blaming the Iranians. Now, if there was a very reasonable proposal on the table, and Trump had proven himself also to be willing and capable and disciplined enough to deliver on it, then I can definitely see that the foreign minister of China would place a phone call to the Iranians, gently urging them to move in that direction, etc. But the idea that they would end up becoming some sort of a tool in America's pressure tactic on Iran, I think the Chinese are too smart to get entangled in that matter.
I have talked to some China skeptics who are analysts and political figures in the region that believe that there is a potential trade-off. They're speculating. There's a potential trade-off with China possibly urging Iran to take a maybe even worse deal in exchange for easing the military allegiance that America has with Taiwan, using Taiwan as a permanent base, as a thorn on the side of China in its own regional interests. Do you find that to be a likely scenario, knowing what you know about China's unbelievably pragmatic approach and its ultimate interest in making sure that there is some sort of reunification, most likely a peaceful reunification with Taiwan? Given that being the highest priority for China, could they potentially use Iran as a trade-off, given the relationship that they have and their lack of interest, the lack of ideological commitment to waging some sort of anti-imperialist war, for example?
So I personally, and I want to make it clear, I'm not a China expert, so I'm not going to try to pretend to know exactly what the Chinese calculations are. But from where I stand, I find it somewhat unlikely, at least at this moment, for the Chinese to make calculations of this kind, because it would be entanglement at the end of the day into this issue, in which is contrary to China's first principles. Don't get involved. And if you suddenly have made that type of a deal, that triangular deal, in which is reduced support for Iran in return for this from the American side, you're already starting to entangle yourself a little bit in a way that I don't think the Chinese would do unless the situation is much graver and they're much more likely to succeed. They want to have a much higher likelihood of success for anything. Secondly, this presumes a degree of trust and confidence on the Chinese side that Trump will deliver on his promises to China. I don't see them having that. So that would make it very risky for them to damage potentially their relationship with Iran, which at the end of the day is not unimportant to them, for a very flimsy likelihood that Trump will deliver on his end of the bargain. So under normal circumstances, could it perhaps have been more likely? Perhaps, but you add the Trump factor into it, and you add the very clear track record that we see, that the Chinese see, of how Trump is conducting himself. And I just don't find it likely that the Chinese, who are so cautious, and many would legitimately, in my view, justifiably at times, criticize them of being too cautious. I mean, there's been much easier
That's me. I'm
scenarios.
that guy.
Yeah. I mean, there's been plenty of situations in the region in which much more much higher likelihood of success for the Chinese to step in and do something diplomatically, and they just decided to stay out.
Yeah.
They decided to stay out because, again, they're very risk averse. They stepped in when it came to Iran and Saudi Arabia because of a specific request from MBS himself. And it was also a scenario in which the Iraqis and others had already mediated extensively between the Iranians and the Saudis. The deal was 90% ready.
Mm-hmm.
And the MBS himself directly pleaded with Xi. And they did this. And immediately afterwards, you could see how the Chinese started to become uncomfortable. On the one hand, they were glad to get the credibility and the credit for all of this. On the other hand, they were very unhappy to see that demands and expectations that the Chinese would step in more often were rising as a result of this. And they really clearly wanted to push down those expectations.
Even Western analysts at the time said, "Oh, it's your problem now." Some, at least on Foreign Policy magazine, said, "Okay, well, good luck to China for doing this." And I read it as jealousy at the time, but I guess they weren't so wrong. Now, there's one factor here at play that, once again, we have to go back to, which is Israel. China does have a lot of power to apply pressure to every country, really. But from what I have seen, what I've read, it kind of feels as though China is just treating Israel as America's problem and a reliable trade partner at times as well. But they're not using any leverage that they have to try to talk to Israel at all. I don't know if that's because they see that as overstepping, because they talk to America directly, or if there's any way to bring about some sort of regional stability. All of that still goes through Israel, realistically. Is there any reason as to why they have, in your opinion, refused to try and deal with Israel at all, even if it's anything beyond simply offering condemnations at the UN?
I think it's an excellent question. I want to again emphasize
you're not a China expert.
I'm not a China expert. Yeah, but I have been able to observe closely and have had extensive conversations with Chinese officials about their approach to the Middle East. And I think there is a fundamental error here amongst many people who are looking forward to the days of multipolarity. They're hoping that some of America's problematic, to say the least, approaches in certain regions will be balanced out because another superpower or a constellation of other powers will be able to push it back. Middle East is obviously the obvious one. But I think the error here is to believe that China would more or less behave like previous superpowers we have seen, either from the Western Bloc or from the Eastern Russian Bloc. That is not how they are considering themselves as a major power. They've made it very clear they're not following the blueprint of previous superpowers or Western superpowers when it comes to this. They're not going to automatically take the side against the United States in a lot of conflicts. More than anything else, they want to manage the world together with the United States, not in an antagonistic manner, but in a manner that maximizes stability and further enhances China's ability to grow economically. This is their main objective. They can look at a lot of these different injustices. They may feel bad about it, but they don't have that same type of a messianic urge that you see in a lot of Western states in which they think God wants them to get involved in this, or that God has decided that they are the ones to solve this issue. That's just not how they're approaching these things. Yeah. And so even in some cases in which they could easily have come in to really embarrass the United States by solving some issues or pushing for some sort of a movement towards a solution and show how much more of a responsible actor they may be, they've refrained from doing so because their game is not about embarrassing the United States. Their game is about making sure that the world moves towards some sort of a new constellation. It will probably be some sort of a bipolar plus multipolar context. And in that, they want the United States and China not to have the relationship that the US and the Soviet Union did, but have a very collaborative approach in which they together take responsibility for security and manage the world's problem and maximize its security. And that partly means that they will not pick fights with the United States on issues that the United States seems to have an irrational degree of attachment and commitment to. And that brings us back to Israel and the Middle East. Yeah. So I think we should have, they will make their statements at the UN. They will take nominally the position that is way more in accordance with international law, but to expect them to really put political capital to push something that would be seen as antagonistic by the United States, at least for now, and probably for the next 10 years. I don't see the Chinese going in that direction. You know what the first thing they did after they negotiated the Saudi Iran deal and it was a success? After they clinched it, the first thing they did the next day, they went in and they fully briefed the White House on all of the details of it, etc., with full transparency. The United States never does that with the Chinese. Whenever the US does something, even if it happens in China's own neighborhood. But this was part of their way of saying, we're not doing this to screw you over. We're not doing this to embarrass you. This is just something that we could do. We hope that you will find use for it. And here's how we did it.
Given that the United States' approach is almost single-handedly in the hands of Donald Trump at this point, regardless of what more calmer minds or whatever kind of sober analysis and assessment they're offering to Donald Trump, he ends up making these erratic decisions. And given that Trump's tendency, as he has demonstrated over and over again, is to perceive concessions or reasonable moves that his opposition are making to be a sign of weakness, as he's done so with Iran over and over again. Do you feel like Trump is going to miscalculate even China's restraint in this process as potential weakness, and then do something erratic there as well? The reason why I keep asking about this, the reason why I keep asking about China, even though you're not a China expert, is because there is now going to be a talk that takes place in Beijing. It was supposed to have taken place already last month or this month, and now it's been pushed to May 14th. And I wanted to ask you, this deal that is in place right now in Iran, that's supposed to be implemented, that is currently in a legal limbo, if it's not completed by the time Donald Trump travels to Beijing, do you feel like America will have a significant weakness in these talks with Xi Jinping? And do you feel as though that is going to force Donald Trump to try to manage this negotiation the closer he gets to the Beijing summit, and he might even cancel it altogether? What do you think the likelihood of that is?
I think, first of all, you're quite right. It will be problematic from Trump's position if he travels to Beijing, has this very crucial summit with Xi, and he is still suffering from the repercussions of the problem that he caused himself by starting this idiotic war. He has once again proven himself incapable of establishing stability. No one remembers the success he had in Venezuela. Everyone talks about the lack of success and the idiocy of going into Iran, the foolishness of thinking this could be done in 4 days, all of these different things. So this will put him in a much, much worse position. He's suffering from higher oil prices. He is at his lowest level with Republicans, his lowest level with independents. He looks as if he's going to be a lame duck president in just a couple of months because the Republicans are likely to lose the House, the Senate. This is not the position he wanted to be in when he went to Xi. And the thing you mentioned about miscalculation with the Chinese, I think he is more careful with the Chinese because I think he has a better assessment of what China's actual power and role is. And he understands it and manages to discipline himself. With the Iranians, he's still suffering from the false belief that Iran would collapse within 4 days. And he really hasn't managed to grapple that he really is going to have to give a real concession and compromise in order to get a deal. He's still coming at this thinking that there's some sort of a silver bullet he can use to win this negotiation through humiliating the other side and getting a total victory and a total surrender from the other side. It was never in the cards. It is not going to be in the cards. There is no silver bullet. The only silver bullet he can really put together is a smart diplomatic strategy, which would entail absolutely zero Truth Social posts for at least a week or so until this is done. But everything that he's doing, whether it is the blockade of the blockade, etc., it's all the same game plan as in the past. It's belief that if you just do this one small thing, the whole house of cards of Iran is going to collapse. And the Israelis are very active in kind of pushing these type of things.
Yeah.
So I don't think that he treats the Chinese in the same way. He has a better assessment and fortunately listens to more people than he does on Iran. Will he cancel again? I don't know. There's a lot of different factors coming in, but I do believe that he canceled the first one precisely because of this. He thought he was going to go in there with Venezuela and Iran in his pocket in a very strong position. It is simply not the case. It will not be the case most likely by May 14th either. So it remains to be seen whether it takes place or not. I had conversations with the Chinese who were very frustrated, very angry that he had canceled it the first time. So I don't know what the repercussions from the Chinese will be if he postpones it once more. And remember, the Chinese agenda has very little to do with what's going on in the Persian Gulf and Iran. They have their own issues that they want to talk to the United States about.
Yeah. I think what you said about assuming tremendous leverage leading up to these talks in Beijing with Venezuela and potentially with Iran is exactly what America thought was going to happen. But it's very clear by now to everyone with 3 working brain cells that the false information that was fed to Donald Trump about how easy and how similar to Venezuela this operation in Iran would look like was fed to him by Israel. Is there any point, do you think, where Trump will say, okay, enough is enough. You guys have lied to me over and over again about your capabilities, the capabilities of Iran. It's very clear that Iran is not destroyed, and you're feeding me this false information in an effort to push me further and further up the escalation ladder because it suits your purpose, and there is now no longer a convergence but a divergence in interests. We can see that, but do you feel like Donald Trump will actually see that at any point?
I think to a certain extent it has already happened because he did agree, or he pushed for that ceasefire and he got it. The Israelis didn't want it. So I think to a certain extent it has happened. Will he do that type of a complete break with them and said, everything you guys have told me to do has been complete nonsense. I'm not going to listen to you guys at all any longer? No, he will not do that. Because that means that he will lose his biggest financial supporter right now, which is Miriam Adelson.
Yeah.
And to do that before crucial midterm elections, in which a lot of other people already have lost faith in him because he was supposed to push out the neocons, not put them at the center of his foreign policy. But yet there he is, retweeting Mark Levine and repeating a lot of the stuff that FDD and others are saying. So I'm not saying that he's completely lost that other wing, but confidence have really been shaken. And that confidence is not going to come back easily, even if he does that break, particularly mindful of the fact that that break is not going to be complete. Now, will a lot of people from what I would call the Tucker Carlson wing of the party be extremely happy if he strikes a deal, gets out of this mess, and even pushes back hard against the Israelis? Absolutely. But Trump will be in a situation in which he will have ticked off both of the main wings of his party. And without knowing for certain exactly where the end balance is going to be for him just months, weeks before the midterm elections. And I think that's going to weigh heavily on his mind. And again, this is not the same as some of the YouTube influencers or very critical people within the MAGA movement, from Megyn Kelly to Tucker to others, Steve Bannon, criticizing the policies, etc., online. This is about the Israelis pulling out all of the stops and trying to undermine and sabotage Trump, not just his diplomacy, but everything else they can do, just like they tried to do and did with Obama in 2015, between 2013 and 2015, including, as we all saw, that Netanyahu even went to Congress to give that speech against Obama, which of course could only have happened because the Republicans invited him. This would not happen now. But nevertheless, it's just a sign of
there
how
were also
far.
Democrats too. There were plenty of Democrats that
Yeah.
also were in support, Chuck Schumer being one of the key allies there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But the point being, it's just a sign of how far they were willing to go to undermine him. Again, mindful of the fact that this would be not only an end to the war, it would be sanctions relief. And what I think will happen if there is a deal, there will be a deal that is far bigger and deeper than the JCPOA, in the sense that the sanctions relief will be far more massive. Sanctions relief in the JCPOA was only UN sanctions and then secondary American sanctions, meaning the sanctions the US imposes on Chinese, Indian, and European companies if they trade or invest in Iran. What's at the center of this negotiation is primary sanctions, meaning the sanctions that the US imposes on American companies. That would be devastating for the Israelis. They will do everything they can to prevent that. And again, if you're sitting in Trump's shoes right now trying to figure out which political path to take, it has to be intimidating knowing what hell will break loose if he actually agrees to a deal. Doesn't mean, by the way, that I'm not arguing that he shouldn't do it. He absolutely should strike that deal. We should just be very clear about the intense fight that will follow if he goes down that path.
So let's talk about the actual deal in place. There's a 10-point plan that Iran has basically had publicly revealed since, I believe, the second week of the war. There's been some changes on it. I have a degree of emphasis on, from my own estimation, what I think Iran cares about a lot and what I think is likely and what I think Iran doesn't care about as much. And I wanted to run that by you and see if you have any disagreements there. I think one of the most consequential elements of this deal is the Lebanese ceasefire. And the reason why I say that, consequential as in it's the most, I think it's the hardest one to accomplish. Why is it the hardest one to accomplish? Because it goes directly against the interests of Israel. And it's a demand not made specifically to protect Hezbollah in the way that it's being presented, but I think it's a demand being made to the United States of America to enforce maximum leverage that Iran has to force America to restrain Israel, something that has not happened in the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years at this point. I think that's probably the most significant ask that Iran is making, even beyond the sanctions relief, although obviously the sanctions relief would be the most consequential one and the most beneficial one. I think from the perspective of the Iranian side, driving any sort of wedge between the relationship between the United States of America and Israel, or at least forcing America's hand into taking action against Israel, is the maximum leverage position. So that's my first statement, and I want to hear if you agree with that or not, or where you're at on that side of the bargain. And I think the least consequential one is one that they've already conceded to, which is, of course, the enriched uranium. The American demands for it, from what I understand, are something that Trump wants to present as an aesthetic victory. It's 20 years as opposed to Iran agreeing to 5 years of control over their enriched uranium stockpile. Even though the Iranian side is still maintaining this posture that they don't want anything to happen to their enriched uranium stockpile whatsoever, and that actually violates their sovereignty. Do you feel like Iran is simply saying that in order to posture? Do you disagree that this is probably the easiest condition that America has demanded from Iran that Iran would be on board with, that Iran would concede to? Outside of that, you obviously, I think you and I agree on the sanctions relief side. So what do you think about those two major points?
So a couple of things. Let me also say one thing on sanctions relief before that, because I don't want to leave the impression that the sanctions relief is the hardest because Trump is opposed to it. I think actually Trump is the president that would be most in favor of offering sanctions relief. He's not a fan of sanctions. He's a fan of tariffs. But sanctions actually punish American companies. So the idea of lifting primary sanctions and getting American companies into Iran would be a huge sell to his own base. I mean, you have $300 billion of damages minimum in Iran right now. There's going to be massive reconstruction efforts. I'm not saying that the Iranians will welcome all American companies right away or in a large manner,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, this would be the largest economy that would open up since the fall of the Soviet Union. And he said numerous times on the campaign trail back in 2015 that his opposition to the JCPOA, Obama's deal, was because it was unfair to American companies, because it only lifted sanctions on European companies and Chinese and Indians, but not on American companies. No Trump Towers in Tehran. So I think actually he's ideologically inclined to agree to that and be, quite open to lifting a lot of it. It's just that the political fight he will have with the Israelis afterwards or during that process is going to be absolutely beyond anything he's had so far. Lebanon, I think you're right. I think Lebanon is going to be a very, very tricky thing. And as you mentioned, part of it is because the Iranians want to see that Trump is serious about really reining in the Israelis. Part of it is, of course, also that the United States wants to talk about what the US calls Iran's proxies. Well, the Iranians view them as allies, and the United States views Israel as an ally. Is this going to be a ceasefire between Iran and the US, or is it a ceasefire that entails Israel? If it entails Israel, and Iran cannot attack Israel, Israel cannot attack Iran, so an American ally has been included in the ceasefire, then the Iranians are going to say, well, then Iranian allies should be included as well. Because otherwise, you have a scenario in which Iran cannot strike at Israel. Israel cannot strike at Iran, but Israel can strike at these different groups that are associated with Iran without Iran being able to do anything about that. So I think the Iranians in that case are going to say, in that case, let's just have a ceasefire between the US and Iran. And then it's everything is permitted between Israel and Iran and between Iran and Israel and many of these different groups. And that also then means there is no agreement that other groups in Iraq and elsewhere in the region will cease fire on the US. Either you include them or you don't include them.
So it's beyond Lebanon and Hezbollah is what you're saying, because that was my initial assessment as well. I was I mean, obviously, Marandi is not in any way, shape, or form affiliated with the administration, but he is one of the only people that I've heard maintain the position that this also includes even Hamas, like the entirety of the axis of resistance, whereas official communiques make it seem as though this is just, well, on the Iranian side, some of their reporting says it is the axis of resistance. Not sure if that includes Hamas or not, but certainly Iraq and other regional actors as well. Is that your understanding of the deal as well?
I can certainly see that from the Iranian side. They would view that as the most attractive solution or agreement, because it would mean that Israel cannot attack any of their allies and vice versa. And the United States is very adamant that they want to put pressure on Iran for Iran to put pressure on some of these different groups, Houthis, Iraqi militias, etc., not to attack US. So the question, what kind of balance you can find there? I can see from a US standpoint also say, you know what, let's actually end all of it, right? No attacks from the Houthis, no attacks from the Iraqi militias, none of these things. And then the question is, yes, but you have one ally that wants to bomb everyone all the time. What are you going to do about that? So I think it's going to be a tough negotiation on that issue, the maximalist position from the Iranian side, which could be accepted by the US. I don't think necessarily is going to end up. But if it is very, very weak, it also means that ultimately the ceasefire between Iran and the US will also be weak. Not because the US and Iran would want to go back into the war, but if fighting in Lebanon can continue, in West Bank and Gaza can continue, and Israel can strike the Houthis, it means that we will have the same scenario that we did after October 7th. And remember, back then, a lot of the concerns were this conflict, if it's not stopped, will spill over into the rest of the region. More than twice now, it has done exactly that. And the second time, it led to this disastrous regional war. So if you really want to avoid a recurring scenario of this kind, you do need to pacify all of these other theaters, not just the ones between the US and Iran directly. So I think there's a strong argument, regardless whether you're coming at it from the US side or from the Iranian side, that it would actually be better to get a complete ceasefire throughout the entire region. Now, what was the third factor? And I forgot right now.
The third
Your
factor
dog
was
distracted me. It's a beauty.
Yeah, she's a big guard dog. The third factor was the enriched uranium, and how much of that is actually, I guess, not negligible necessarily, but like, what are the red lines there? And because my estimation is, considering that they had already conceded to, according to the Omani negotiators, in the beginning phase before America engaged in perfidy again alongside Israel, was the idea that Iran was totally willing to lean into American demands on that front. Obviously, the red lines are, the ridiculous asks were on, restricting the missile strike capabilities. Like, that's, totally ridiculous. But the nuclear side has always been Iranian leverage. They have, in a way that I might even say is naive, have refused to engage in enriching uranium beyond, or the only time they've engaged in enriching uranium beyond civilian grade is specifically to gain leverage to bring America back to the negotiation table in exchange for sanctions relief. Trying to force America to abide by something similar to the JCPOA. Do you feel like that's still the case, or do you think that now they have more leverage over the United States of America and therefore they really want to force it?
Yeah. So I think your original premise is correct. This is probably not easy, but one of the easier challenges within the negotiations, because they already traveled a significant distance through the mediation of the Omanis. A mechanism was invented, put together, that was designed to make Trump feel that he has achieved his red line. His red line adopted later on in the game, which was essentially the Israeli red line, zero enrichment. So that, and part of the reason why the Iranians say 5 years and the US is 20 now, first of all, just saying any number from the US is a deviation from the Israeli line, right? Suddenly you're talking numbers instead of indefinitely. So that in itself is interesting, even though 20 years is a very, very significant amount of time. Now, the justification for 5 in the previous negotiations was essentially that the Iranians said, okay, we would only enrich uranium for 2 identified needs, 2 reactors they have. One is a reactor that is not even online for another 7 years, and one is a reactor that was given to the Iranians in the late 1960s by the US and that is currently used for research and medical isotopes for cancer patients. That reactor already has fuel pads that will last it another 5 to 7 years. So the number 5, I don't think, is just thrown out as any bargaining thing. It is designed to function within this this larger mechanism, saying, well, they're only needing to enrich uranium for these 2 reactors, and currently they don't need it because they have it for another 5 years. Could there be a scenario in which a third country, France, provides fuel pads for the Tehran research reactor for an additional 5 years, and for that other new reactor, so that the Iranians actually don't have a need for 10 years? I can see the Iranians being flexible on this. 20 may be too far, but this would require that the fuel pads are delivered right away, I would suspect, not that they're hoping that it will be delivered down the road. I can see something like that potentially working out, and they could extend that number. And I think part of the reason why the Iranians are not walking back the Geneva proposal, but seem to still be negotiating from it, should be really seen as very positive from the American side, because you could easily have a scenario in which they're like, you know what? No, you didn't win this war. In fact, you lost it strategically. Our position has strengthened, and our position on on these different nuclear issues have been hardened, and you're going to get less. I suspect, and particularly mindful of the fact that the debate inside of Iran has also shifted in the sense that there is far more support for weaponization now than there ever was before. One can see that scenario. But I suspect the reason why they have stuck to the Geneva proposal is because they have instead just increased the sanctions lifting demand, saying, yes, we can still do this, but the price is now higher. And the price is that, all of the UN sanctions, all of this of the primary sanctions need to be lifted. Because if the Iranians give up this leverage, this is the last time they can actually ask for sanctions relief. Having gotten it, what leverage do they have to even get the US to the table down the road?
Yeah.
So this is essentially the last moment. And so I think they're going to offer almost everything and demand almost everything in return.
But unfortunately, Donald Trump sees any kind of concession or even a willingness to cooperate with coming to the table as a sign of weakness, unfortunately. And you have malignant actors that are doing their very best, that have profound amounts of influence, if not the last remaining line of defense amongst Trump's domestic allies and foreign allies that are going to do their very best to sell you the deal. Trita Parsi, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was wonderful. I have to go pee.
Appreciate it.
But thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Likewise.
And hopefully we'll talk to you again soon under better conditions. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hasan. Really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Tomorrow's news today.